Welcome to the podcast, Andrew Randell. Most notably, my former coach, but currently the head coach of the British women rowing team, the head coach, multi-time Olympic medal coach now. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Lovely to be on the podcast, Sam.
It's
Looking
going to
forward
be great to catch up because I've known you for a while, and you are both the first coach that's on the podcast, but we haven't caught up in a few years, and there's things that I want to know about you that I just don't, because by the time you're an athlete at a school and someone says this is the coach now, you don't know
Yeah.
anything about the genesis story. I just knew you as you, and then it occurs to me now, how did you get to that point in time? So how did you even get started with rowing?
Oh, as I don't know, you're probably aware, but I grew up in Papua New Guinea. My mum and dad were laymen in the tropics, so I spent 10 years in Papua New Guinea from 64 to 70, 74, 75. And independence was coming to Papua New Guinea in the mid 70s. So my parents were always planning to come back to Australia. So 76 was independence in Papua New Guinea. So they were planning to come back to Australia in 76. So 74, they sent me to boarding school in Perth, which is probably 7,000 miles away, but
Mm.
anyway, from where we were living in Papua New Guinea. So, and that's a Methodist boarding school in Perth, which has a large rowing program.
So you and
And
Ellen?
basically, Ellen stayed in Papua New Guinea. Ellen and
Yeah,
Erica both stayed right
yeah.
through to the end. They didn't come to boarding school. But my brother was, at that stage, I was about 10 and my brother was 11. So they wanted my brother to start in year seven in Australia, in the schooling system in Australia.
So
So it
even
was
though
the first
you were younger than him, they sent you off to like,
with
to
him.
boarding
Yeah, the
school.
two of them.
Yeah. Oh, you
Yeah,
both went. Okay.
we both
Yeah.
went.
Yeah.
So he went and started year seven in
Yeah.
Australia, and I started year six. So I
Okay.
did year six and seven at boarding. He did year seven and eight. He started secondary school, and that was the reason basically because we did first 3 or 4 years of our schooling was correspondence because we were out in the bush, so it was all school of the air and
Mm.
paperwork and then we moved to just outside of Port Moresby where we a place called Hula Hula or Kwikila where we went to a little 12 kids school, which one teacher school. She taught from years one to year 12 in the one school. That was that was just on the mission there. But so then that was our first, and then we moved to Papua New Guinea to Port Moresby for the last 3 or 4 years, which we went to a mainstream primary school there. But it was just transition back to Australian schooling system that they were interested in. So we went over to Perth I went into year six, Doug went into year seven. And of course, being a big private boarding school, they had a big rowing program, not particularly successful, but it was still a big program and the boarders all rowed. So in wintertime, we played hockey, which was one of the numbers four, footy, but I tended to play hockey. In summertime, we rowed because it was the big sport at the school. So that's kind of the introduction
Do you
back in
remember how
those
you
early.
felt at boarding school in year six?
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
My parents, they briefed us pretty well. They said, we'd be pretty lonely and we wouldn't be able to get back home for 12 months because it was way back in, it was a long way from Perth to Papua New Guinea, Port
Yeah.
Moresby. But we had grandparents in Perth, we had uncles and aunties, we had cousins, and they were the days. It wasn't like your boarding schools. It was like you're allowed out on week for a weekend, one weekend every term. There were 3 terms a year. It might have been 2 weekends that term. We could go to visit, stay at the grandparents for a couple of nights. You're allowed one street leave, so in the middle of the week, but you basically kept on site the whole time. So, that was one of my big learnings early on was, we didn't have anything to do. Study was, even in year six, I had an hour of prep every night, after dinner, 6:45 to 7:45 was prep. We sat at our
Mhm.
desk, we lie in the beds. The senior boys were, we had to study. And then in the daytime, there's just so much time over Friday, Saturday, Sunday. What are you going to do at boarding school? You couldn't go out. You had all those weekends in. So I'd play hockey in winter and we'd row or do some kind of sport and summer tennis or whatever. So I learned very quickly the power of repetition, practice. If I never played hockey in my life, by the time I left boarding school 2 years later, I was getting best and fairest. And, I just from 2 years, I went from nothing to really, quite a good hockey player. And, it was the same with the tennis, just hitting a ball against a wall. Every afternoon, I got very, very good at it very quick. So that power of repetition, that's kind of what boarding school told me, even to the degree of translating it to academia. I wasn't a particularly good academic at that time. But having to sit at a desk and do, an hour of work, even at year 6 every day, and it was 2 hours on Sundays or something like that. Just that discipline of sitting there and, well, you may as well make use of your time. I'd go over my notes. All of a sudden, I'd get a little bit better, and you think, oh, well, that worked. I'll do that again next week. That success breeds success type principle. So I learned all those things at boarding school: power of repetition. Just the work ethic. Doing that, it taught me a tremendous amount. So when my parents came back 2 years later, and I moved across to the East States, I got jobs in Canberra with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and I went to a local high school there. But it just set me up very well for, doing well academically and sporting wise, because, had that somehow had that ingrained in me that if I did enough practice, I'd get good at something, didn't matter what it was.
And
So,
were you club rowing in Canberra then?
Canberra Rowing Club, yeah.
Yeah.
Poor mum used to drop me off there in the mornings, and I was pretty lucky in some ways that there was a good group of us at the time. We went through together, and in year 11 and 12 I had a very good 4, which won the New South Wales state titles. So, and that kind of was the stimulus for me to probably get stuck into rowing. It was quite successful. I was in the Canberra days. Canberra was a very arty-farty place, and I was heavily involved with music at the Canberra School of Music. I was on a clarinet scholarship. I was playing in the Canberra Youth Orchestra. I went on a world tour with them in 1978. Well, it could have been 1980. Can't remember now. But I went on a world tour with them. So I was very much going down the music route. And then I took a year off at 18. Came over to Europe with the orchestra. We played at the International Youth Orchestra Festival in Aberdeen, and then went around Europe to France and Belgium and a few other places. Bottom of England, we played concerts, and then they went home, and I stayed on because you could extend your ticket for 12 months. I stayed on in Europe, and I played. I took a few lessons with Jack Brymer, who at the time was principal clarinetist in the London Philharmonic. Well, could have been Simp, but anyway, he'd been around for a long time. He got me a job at Boozy and Hawkes, which is the instrument factory at Edgware. I think it was, yeah, Edgware. Edgecliff is in Australia, Edgware.
Yeah.
And I worked with them for 6 months and earned a bit of money because I was only 18 or 19. So I worked in the factory tuning clarinets for them for 6 months, and then I backpacked around Europe. So when I got back, I deferred university, which was music, for 12 months. I was going to go to the Canberra School of Music and do music there for my undergrad degree. But when I got back, I still had 6 months time before uni started. I got back in November. That was the end. We went in November at year 12. I missed, the last term of year 12, but I'd already done enough units to graduate. It's the American system in Canberra. You just got to do your 30 units. So I'd missed that part of the year, came back in November, had to wait till March to start uni. So I didn't have a lot on. So I started rowing again, and we did really well. And then I made a B team. So then I changed my uni degree to a sports science degree, because the clarinet teacher I was under at the time, he very understandably elitist, he basically said to me, unless you're a full-time musician, I'm not interested in keeping on scholarship. And, I thought at the time, well, I'm not really good enough to be a soloist. I could do this and get a job in an orchestra, but then I'm going to spend the next 30 years playing Beethoven Fifth and Tchaikovsky Fourth. Yeah, you play the same repertoire over.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're a soloist, you're probably, it's limited in that regard. So I made that decision then, well, I'll go down the sports science route. And so then I started rowing and did sports science. And so rowed in several B teams, and they all made me train away. So it took me 6 years to do my undergraduate, because I had a year on, year off, because I'd make a team in April. It's mid semester 1, and then I'd come back from New Zealand or wherever in mid semester 2. And if the units had prerequisites, you missed a whole year. So it just took me a long time to get my first degree done.
Was the view to be a physiologist or something like that, or was it just this
Yeah,
is it was?
it was. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I suppose like all, I think a lot of people at my that age, I either wanted to be a marine biologist because Australia's very ocean orientated,
Mhm.
or sports science, be a physiologist. I was working in Canberra with, you remember these guys, Alan Hahn and Frank Pike, and they're inspirational Australian physiologists. They're very motivated, inspirational type guys, and so they had a big impact on me early. So I actually did when I did my master's degree, I did it with Alan Hahn and Frank Pike. Frank Pike moved to Wollongong, and I did it on the research, the reliability and validity of a system to identify potential Olympic rowers. So that was the
Okay. Yeah.
precursor to Peter Shakespeare's Talent ID. So I worked with
Okay.
Alan Haney validifying the arm leg bike to rowing because we had the rowing machine and we were testing, out in the community on the rowing machine, and we'd find, there was no real correlation with their people's performance on a rowing machine and their VO2 max when we took them in a lab. So we're looking for an apparatus where low skill base, which would link the two up, which is why we went to the arm leg bike because we knew from the PWC 170s and all those tests that bike was good, but we wanted some upper body action in the
Yes.
actual testing apparatus we were
Must have
going
been
to
the
use.
Schwinn Airdyne at that stage.
Yeah, Schwinn was the
Yeah.
big one. So that was my master's thesis, was just doing all the validity studies on showing that, in non-trained rowers, VO2 was, a reliable, using the arm leg bike was a reliable measure for VO2. And if we trained them in rowing, it would replicate well, the VO2 would be coming across well. So
And then what was the transition if you were doing under 23 team stuff and your masters? There must have been a transition from athlete and academic to coaching.
that was an interesting part. I found that, I made the national team in '87, but I could only make teams when they picked an 8 and a 4. I was never good enough as a rower to be in that top group. I was always back into the A final, middle of the A final in the pairs. So if they picked the lightweight 4, then I'd miss out. On the sculling side, it was a double. So I did sculling and sweep several times. So I knew unless it was a big team, I'd probably miss out. So I think there's probably a lot of athletes like that move into coaching who don't quite make it in rowing. The ones that tend to make it, and I'm thinking here of, Drew's probably done a lot of coaching, but Jimmy Tompkins, Drew Gin, those guys who win a lot of gold medals don't tend to go into rowing.
Yeah,
They
but
go,
you are comparing. I mean, there are thresholds of athlete that
yeah,
are sub multi-time Olympic gold medal coaches because
they are. Yeah, they're right. There's
there's
plenty.
multiple gold medalists, there's single
Mm,
gold medalists, then there's medalists, Olympians,
yeah.
and there's levels to it. And I think obviously all of those can end up coaching, but there's probably something to be
Yeah.
said for not achieving that level of attainment that means that you have a desire to go on and do something in the sport that isn't as an athlete.
Yeah. So that transition for me was, I tried to make the team in 1990, which when the World Championships were in Australia, in Tasmania, and I missed out on the team. And so then I said to um, not my wife at that time, my girlfriend, that would be it for me. She'd supported me pretty well in the last couple of years while I did my master's thesis. And I said, look, that'd be it. I'd settle down and get married, have kids, and after 1990, which is what we did. And I went into health management. So I worked for the number one health insurance company, HBA Health Management, as an exercise physiologist. We'd do blue ribbon health checks for corporate clients. I did it for Bondi and people, one multimillionaire. And it was a blue ribbon service. They'd come in, they'd see a doctor for half an hour. He'd do the medicals. They'd, come in to see me. I'd do hearing, eyesight. We'd do a full stress ECG, wired up on the treadmill. And then they'd see we do skin folds diet, 5-day diet, that type of thing. And then they'd see a psychologist and look at stress life management. So, and then we'd go out and counsel. And I loved that work. I did
You
it for 3
did.
years.
It
Yeah.
was, it was fulfilling.
yeah, it was really fulfilling,
Yeah.
just working with top, fair income people, who were very
Yeah.
successful in life and just having an impact. They were very keen, on the data. They were data driven, most of these guys. They were to see their cholesterol, their skin folds, how it fitted up with the norms in across the population, where their risks were. They were smart people. So they'd get a lot out of the service. So I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the counselling side. It was a bit like education, teaching, coaching.
Yeah.
But it was 9 to 5. It was, at work at 8:30, leaving at 5. And I kind of wasn't really used to that. So Tim McLaren was the one who, Grammar was looking for a coach, and they were either going to Townsend, I think was their headmaster at the time, and they'd been unsuccessful for 20 years. Rusty Robinson was the last time that they'd actually won ahead of the river. And so they'd asked Tim McLaren to look for a coach that would come in and either ramp up the system, or they were going to drop it and leave it altogether, because it was quite expensive and they hadn't done well for years and years. So Tim approached me and said, "Oh, Grammar's looking for a coach. Would you like to, have a go at that?" And I was at that time I'd worked for 3 years in corporate, and I was thinking, well, I should do a PhD. I don't know why I was thinking that, but I should do. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do it in cardiovascular research at one of the hospitals. Westmead was my desired choice because it's a real good professor out there. And I thought, oh, but how am I going to, the grammar job opportunity came up, and I thought, well, that's near St. Vincent's. There was a guy at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research who had been through grammar, Professor Eisman. And when he heard that I was talking, he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Come and do a PhD with me." So he's really keen. It was in bone, not in cardiovascular disease. But the arrangement I got to in the end was, I would I'd run the rowing program in summer, and I'd do the PhD in winter up the road. It was 200 meters up the road to St. Vinny's Hospital. So that to me seemed an ideal balance, and the school was happy to pay me a teacher's salary rather than the NHMRC scholarship, which is 24,000 tax free or something. The teacher's salary was 50,000. So I thought, I was talking cheese, I'd be double on what the other PhD scholars are. So it was a good opportunity for me. And all the time I've been coaching part-time for Harold, doing the lightweight for New South Wales, and just a few crews here and there. And
Oh, so you had been maintaining some connection with the sport.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and coaching was always outside of the 9 to 5. It was, it was one of those things where, my wife was a musician, and she'd go off to a gig. She played for the Party Girls and did band gigs, for in around town, like Phantom of the Opera and Les Mis, and we've played in a few bands. She's a trumpet player, and she'd go off at night at 5 o'clock and have a ball and come in 11 and go 9 to 5. I'm not having the ball like she's having,
Yeah.
So it was kind of that contrast. And the rowing was for me very similar to what she was getting out of her music, which was just an enjoyable night out, the days off. And so I thought, well, why am I working 9 to 5? And I'm not really enjoying it. The rowing's pretty good, which is the other incentive to go to grammar, was just to do something that I really enjoyed that I
I thought
didn't
you said
find.
that the physiology gig was, you did enjoy it and was fulfilling though.
Oh, I did. I did for the 3 years, but I couldn't see myself doing it for 20 years or 30
Yeah.
years. That was, yeah, it was, one of those things where the education side, but there was still a lot of mundane in it. I don't want to get too precious. There's a lot of mundane in everything, whether you're a truck driver, a receptionist, or a rowing coach. There's a lot of mundane,
Yeah, there
in all.
sure is. Boat
So,
loading.
but there's mundane and there's mundane. There's effort. I mean, I could coach 20 hours, 100 hours a week. It's not an effort for me.
Yeah.
But if I'm sitting in an office, that's an effort. It's hard work.
Yeah,
So
it's pick your poison, especially if you're looking down doing it for decades.
yeah,
That's a
absolutely.
proposition.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you know Tim at that stage? I mean, is that from being on
Um,
teams and just, in rowing in New South Wales as a small community? So,
yeah, I met Tim through Rusty Robinson.
yeah,
I actually lived with Rusty above his laundromat with his with his, with his wife at the time, or partner at the time. So that, because I was in Canberra with a team, and they gave me accommodation, and then I stayed on there. So through Rusty, I met Tim, who was, I think, he was the coach at that time. He was the coach at St. George Rowing Club
Mhm.
back in the day. So and he moved to UTS later. But yeah, I'd just known him from being on New South Wales teams and coaching around. He'd coached me several times. He'd been on the coaching. Rusty ran these coaching clinics out at Penrith every January. Tim was always on them, so I knew Tim from them. And Rusty had coached Tim in the '84 quad that won a silver medal. Tim was in that quad.
It's about the
So
reverse margin of the distance by which your crew
yeah, that's
won.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah. With Rusty, as long as I've known you, I've known that he was a big influence on you as an athlete and as a coach. What did you learn from him?
um, there's just the basics of technique. I think he was. It reminds me a bit of Harry Mahon because I did some work with Harry Mahon at various times over the years, and very Harry and Rusty, both Kiwis, both from that era, very technically based. A lot of talk about touch and feel, a lot of strike drills, a lot of they did all of that stuff. So they
Okay.
weren't that big on the physiology side. It wasn't the East German approach where you do miles and miles, miles. It was more. Rusty's approach was more one day light, one day on, one day light, one day on, one day light. You do that. He had Fridays off was, always his day off. And that was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off, Saturday, Sunday at Penrith, and always aerobic and aerobic, aerobic and aerobic. It was that kind of, every second day you just get flogged, so it was Italian style. I don't know
Hmm.
where they came at that, but that was I think he probably modified it a bit towards the end, but it was that kind of fast racing work all the, pretty well all the whole time, the whole campaign. There was always racing work in it. Around about 20,
So not
15.
it's more not a linear periodization entirely. There was this sort of simultaneous, you're working on the ability to move at speed whilst developing the
Yeah, that
skills
was the
and
big
physiology.
philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you do enough of it, physiology is there, but you learn that race pace is just there, innate. You know.
Yeah.
So you can do it whenever you want. So that's kind of Rusty's method. If you do enough of work at 34, 35, it becomes very easy. It's probably a bit, my rationale now with from working with Ian Wright is that, and learning a bit more about the Kiwi system under Dick Tonks. And they were very successful. They won 10, 11 gold medals or silver, bronze, silver, gold at world championships a couple of times. The Kiwis won 10, 11 medals, won world championships in the lightweight, so men, women. So, and that whole idea of training at 80% speed at rate 20, that it's exactly the same. I saw a graph the other day from Connie where she overlaid we had, I think, 12 boats out on camp this year. She overlaid the force curves of all the athletes at rate 20 with the profile we did at rate 34. And the force curves were almost identical,
Hmm.
absolutely identical. So it's that whole concept that we work on, that if we do a lot of work at rate 20 at 80% speed, the specificity is so similar to rate 34. The only difference is, of course, there's so much time between each stroke that you don't get cardiac drift, you don't get lactate drift. So you can do it for a long time. You get good aerobic development, good bang for your buck, and the specificity to race is always there. You can always just turn on a race and set up at 34, no problems. So that whole point is really powerful.
And then how did you end up at King's?
What I do, I did 4 years at grammar, and I was the first full-time sports coach at grammar. I think anywhere probably in the world at that time, in Australia, anyone. I don't think there's anyone else any other school in the country that paid someone full-time to run
Hmm.
one sport in their school.
Now that's
So
pretty normal.
yeah, there's now it's
Yeah.
totally normal.
Yeah.
My son's just got a job at PLC. He's just rowing master. Doesn't have to teach anymore. Doesn't have to do anything. So I mean that was unheard of. So it was a special arrangement, and there were teachers in the school that weren't happy about it. They didn't understand that I could come in, just run rowing, not teach, not be involved, do the PhD in summer and get a teacher's salary. So there's a bit of concern, within a bit of chat within the teaching staff that the headmaster had to ward off. And so he renewed my contract for 4 years, but to keep them quiet, he said, "Oh, Andrew will be here for another 2 years." After I had a 2-year review, because we came third the first year I was there, and then second and third, or something like that. It's just in those years where, well, you'd know half the guys I coached then, Stuart Welsh and Parksy, and they all went on. There's a big bunch of them that all went on. But we were doing quite well. We were right up on the podium every year. So they renewed my contract for 2 years, but he knew that he'd have problems with the staff if I went for more than 4 years. So at the end of that 4 years, I'd pretty well finished my PhD. I was trying to think of what do I do now? You know, for grammar job's coming to an end, and of course, I can't remember who at King's, but someone at King's approached me, and they said, "We'd like you to come and run the rowing program," you know, and at King's, but you'll have to teach. So,
I do remember
that was
that you were there was a couple of years where you were
the
teaching
worst
science,
science teacher at King's. I was
not not known as a sort of pillar of consistency in the classroom. And
I
then
was late.
there
I
must have
was
been a
late
point where they're
regularly.
like, let's just have you focus on the coaching.
I'd try and leave work early. You know, I was always coaching in the morning. And I remember I was coaching at the Iron Cave at Drummoyne or whatever. And I'd say, got to leave, got to be on time, got to be on time. But forever in a day, someone would come and ask you something at the shed as you were leaving. And I was regularly late.
It also, I'd imagine over time this has shifted, but that probably at that point wasn't a strength of yours. I think if I think of the attributes that you had more naturally would be stuff like you were pretty calm, although I can think of moments when I may have nudged that.
Exactly.
Like relatively unflappable, but perhaps not as punctual. Whereas I'd imagine now in your role, that's a little bit more dialed in. Was that something that you were aware of at the time? Like, hey, this is something is a bit of a liability.
Oh, look, I think right through my career in those early stages in Australia, it was a constant theme for me, whether I was willing to address it or not. That whole theme of Andrew's always overcommitted, does too many things. Yeah, you know. Um, on the other side, the things I might have been overcommitted, you know, with coaching clubs in the morning, school in the afternoon, teaching, you know, and I had two kids, three kids.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, they were long hours and busy, and I was very busy. But I was still, you know, reasonably successful. So there's probably enough success there for me to say, well, do I really need to change what I'm doing? Do I really, you know, there probably wasn't enough of the negative, the down, for me to say, oh, I should change, or, you know, so. But I think it did lead to some issues later on, you know, where I got targeted and moved, or targeted as an under 23 coach. I think that, you know, I'd spent 10, 12 years in under 23s, and I'm probably the most medalled under 23 junior coach in the country. And I think that was, you know, this is my reflection. I turned down a crew, the women's eight in 96. Bolt and Reinhold were very keen for me to coach the women's eight that year, or the Olympics, but I had my third kid on the way. I was, you know, last year of a PhD. I said I'd go to Canberra for, you know, 6 days a week, but I needed one day at the hospital to tidy up, you know, the last few chapters of a bit of research, and I had, you know, a third child coming. I just wasn't prepared to. I said, look, I'm going to be in Europe for 14 weeks, you know, or America, because it was the LA Olympics. And I wanted that
Atlanta.
1 day a week with the family in Sydney, and they
Yep.
couldn't come with that. You know, maybe they would have these days,
Yeah.
but I
Nowadays
just
they
couldn't.
would.
Yeah, nowadays they would,
Yeah.
because I thought that was a good enough commitment. I'd leave, you know, on lunchtime on Saturday, go back to Sydney, spend Sunday with the family, Monday at the hospital, come back Monday night. So I thought it was a good compromise for those 3 months. But Reinhold being Reinhold, and, you know, just wasn't prepared. He was very, you know, European in that way. You got to either 100% in or you're not in. And I said, well, I'll be 100% in when I'm in Europe and America for 14 weeks. Don't worry.
Yeah.
In the end, I just said, no, I wouldn't do it. I think Steve Evans got that crew in the end. But I think from then on, Reinhold kind of, I never got any offers for the next, you know, not until Harold came along did I get any offers up in the senior team. So I was kind of from then on under 23 junior right the way through, you know, even though I was producing plenty of athletes for them, you know, and pushing them through into the senior team. So my transition to seniors was quite long. I was still coaching teams in the mid-20s. Yeah, 2005, 2006. I was still under 23.
On the
So
production of athletes, there's something that has occurred to me over the years in that there's some school rowing programs that are perpetually successful. Like it always goes in cycles, but there's some schools that no matter the personnel, maybe it's the culture of the school or rowing at the school, that they tend to be successful more often than not. The school that occurs to me is Shaw.
yeah,
And although they'll put people on Olympic and national teams, but they don't necessarily do so at a rate that would be reflective of their performances at school. Whereas I think if I think of the athletes that you've coached at school that have gone on to row the Olympic Games, then the guys you've coached at under 23 level that have gone on. So all
yeah,
of the people that you've coached and influenced, that there must be something about the way you go about it that even if the success wasn't as consistent at a school level, there's something about the way they row or the way they go about it that these athletes go on with the sport and attain a level of success. Is that something you're aware of and were trying to do consciously, or just a byproduct of your approach?
No, look, I'm always acutely aware of that, and you know, as you'd know, I was always promoting the life skills that rowing provides to you, or any high performance sport. And for me, I was always coaching at clubs in the morning and school in the afternoon, so there was always that link between the two for me. Whereas I think those shore coaches like Bob Sherler and Lloydie, they were Lloydie's a bit different now. He's gone international,
Yeah,
but Jennings, if you like, they're teachers primarily. They're not that interested in doing junior teams, or so they're very much focused on just the school stuff, and they're not that next level on. And so perhaps they don't expose the kids to that to the same degree that I always would. I was always looking for who's my next athlete coming into Drummoyne, or who's my next athlete coming to Sydney Uni, or wherever, where am I getting them from? So I was always quite keen on that, and I was always promoting, the life skills you learn, that, the benefits of repetition and success principles, and life skills, and how about going to America? How about doing a university degree over there? It was always forefront of my mind, and so I think that's probably why a lot of my people I coach went on to American universities or under 23 or juniors, or I think it's just the attitude, the approach, more than anything else.
I don't even think it was just at the very high level. That at the top level, everywhere you've coached, like at
Yeah.
Grammar, there's Steve Stewart, for example, and then at King's, there's multiple Olympians that you've gone on to coach, which just can't be a coincidence. And even if I were to extrapolate further, some of the people that you've coached that have coached
Yeah.
have athletes doing the same thing. So you have someone like Matt Ryan who's coached at
Yep.
Wesley, which isn't exactly a rowing powerhouse, but then they've had athletes from there that are recently and currently on the senior team, despite that not being a bastion of rowing
Absolutely.
performance. So I think that it's a legacy of sorts. And I've always, when I was a school coach, I I had to, and I believed it, is no one was going to be less competitive in terms of results than
Yeah.
me. But I also
Yeah.
knew that it can't just be about trying to move a boat faster than someone else. Like that, this is just a vehicle with which to teach kids how to be better people, because for the vast majority, they're not going to be rowing in a year after they finish school. Some will, and some will keep going, and those guys should be pretty handy. But the vast majority of the people you're coaching at a school level, they're drawing something from the sport that has nothing to do with boat propulsion.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There's, that, you know, I've adopted the same philosophy, whichever school I've gone into, whether it be when I went to King's, they'd come sixth, seventh, regularly. They had a drunkard as their rowing master. I can't remember his name, but he was
Nor can
notorious.
I.
He was drunk all the time, and it hadn't been a good 5 or 10 years
Would
for
have been
them.
93, it was the early 80s, so 80 through 84, then 93, they won. That
Yeah,
was
that was about
Mark
it.
Hudson. That was it. That was it in recent history because Kenson Heaps had been successful for a long time, but if you
Mm.
don't upgrade or update your approach, then the sport will often leave you
Very,
behind.
very quickly,
Yeah.
and that's probably one of the that going in there and doing well within a few years, and then I did the same thing at grammar. I went in, they were average, and within a few years we were on the podium, and I did the same at Prince Alfred College in Adelaide. They hadn't won for 20 years, went in, and then we won three in a row. So, you kind of know that what you're bringing is more than just boat speed, because you're attracting people. I remember when I went to Prince Alfred in Adelaide, I had 7 guys the first year I had for the first eight. I didn't have eight. So, and I was talking to Alex Hill was my eighth, and Alex Hill had decided he was going to give away rowing and he was going to play cricket. So I'd ask him all through term four, how many wickets did you take this week, Alex? And he'd go, oh, none, sir. And have a little wry smile. I said, well, I was always right. I asked him again the next, how many wickets did you take this week, Alex?
And
Oh,
just so everyone that's listening knows, this is the now multi-time international medalist Alex Hill, another person that you coached at school level that went on to and has gone on and may continue to keep going, achieved a lot in the sport. Do you remember with Kings, it has a pretty strong sporting culture, at least a strong rugby culture, but at the time that you were coaching and I was there, the late 90s, early 2000s, especially 2000, 2002, there was a time where we were perhaps the best rugby school in the world and the best rowing school. And that has to be said that there has to be something in the culture that supersedes even just one or the other program. Do
yeah.
you remember that being evident at the time, or do you think it was just a matter of the
Look,
way things were?
no, look, I think there was something that struck me very much, the transition from grammar school, Sydney Grammar School to King's. So just a bit of context and background. Grammar was a selective school for high achieving academics. There was an entry level into it. So
Yes.
and even it's in the middle of Sydney, right next to Hyde Park. The chairs in there, the brass plaques are all polished, and it was prim and proper. And then I went to King's, and the wires are hanging out the doors, and it was just like, but it had a completely different feel. The staff at Grammar go to work at 8:30, leave at 3:34. Well, not quite. They do work very hard there because it's a very high achieving school. But there were over 50% of the staff at King's lived on site in those boarding houses and the 50 odd residents that they have on site. And it was its own little community. And the boys were, I think we would have had probably maybe 50% boarders or a bit
Maybe
more,
maybe more. So in the
maybe more,
'01,
70% boarders.
in the 2001 first eight, it
Yeah.
was 8 of 9.
Yeah. So there's no question and the boys were just so different. I remember coaching them and just thinking, well, these are just so much more pleasant. And it was, and I'm sure it's to do with the country background. They're all from the bush and the school of hard knocks. They're much prepared to take ownership of their mistakes and take the rap for other people. Whereas at grammar, it was very much, oh, he did it, sir. No, it wasn't
Yeah.
me, it was him. At King's, they just go, yeah, okay, fair cop. What do you want me to do? That was very much the attitude. So just the feel of the two schools was very different,
Yeah.
and I think Hawkesy did a lot to bring King's up into the modern era. There's no question about it. He rebuilt all those classrooms and modernized the school, made it, brought in landscapers to do the grounds, and now it's a high performing,
But I think
academic.
the culture was there prior to him because I remember being there with John Wickham, and
Definitely.
it was if I think now, what is the one characteristic that was heralded in terms of what was important, what we're looking for? It was probably toughness. Like if
Absolutely, they were tough. King's boys were tough. There's no question, and they wouldn't give you that impression out there. Oh, lackadaisical country type fellas, But underneath, they were bloody tough. They were country bred, and I think that was the main difference that I saw. They weren't city slickers. They came from the school of hard knocks. Out in the
Yeah.
country, posting, fencing, digging. They just knew how to work hard, and that
Yeah.
that was the definite advantage of the school cohort in those days. It was very strong.
These things do evolve over time, but you must have felt, because I didn't know that you boarded. So there must have been a reconnection with a boarding community for you and the things that
Yep.
you benefited from when you were in year six, which is where you kind of got this time where you can work on things and there's a
Yeah,
less
absolutely.
distraction, so you can leverage that. And it took us a few years and took you a few years to I think really maximize the potential that was there. Do you remember, you got a second in 97. I was with Julian Huxley in the
Julian Hooks,
stroke
yeah.
seed, and then one, not a win until 2001. Was
No.
winning the head of the river something that was important for you, or was it just, I'm going to show up and do the best job that I can each year, and the results will be what they are?
No, it was definitely important. I was very results driven. Um, and cracking that first one was probably fairly important. It certainly wasn't the be all and end all, but to say that I wasn't interested in winning would have been very wrong. I was very keen on winning the head of the river. I'd had all those role models before me, like Michael Morgan and Kenton Heaps, and who were my mentors at the school programs. Definitely, and they'd all won multiple head of the river, so I was very keen to win head of the river. So, and it was tough, but also you kind of balance that with, they used to call Michael Morgan, silver medal Morgan, because he had 7 silvers before he won one gold, and then he won the fucking, excuse me, he won a string of
Yeah,
them in
you
a
can
row.
you can swear on this
He,
podcast. Yeah.
he just won, I think he won 7 in a row or something, But before that, he won seven. He came second 7 times,
Is that right?
So yeah, it was a long string of New England coming second to Kings all the time. Kings won 7 in a row,
Okay, so that
and
must have been the early 80s
early 80s,
on
and
the
he was second.
Japan.
Always, they called him Bridesmaid Morgan for a while there in my time because he had so many seconds. But then he had a string of wins.
Yeah.
So it was a bit the same with Kings. I think I won 4 there, 3 in Adelaide. So, and in the end, you kind of, you, yeah, it's just interesting to see. And then I came back to Kings as a consultant this last time, and I hadn't been on the podium for 4 or 5 years. I'd been fifth and sixth, and pointing Julian, who was a rugby coach, but has the same philosophy and
Yep.
mentality as myself, and in there within 2 years we've won again, and
Yep.
so it's an interesting.
And with
Um,
Simon, who was coaching, he was the second aid coach when you were for a couple of
yeah,
years there when you were coaching the first aid. So, it's leveraging there's people that you've been able to influence, and you know that their approach is going to align with how you
same.
want
Yeah,
things done.
I
I
think
do
that's
ask
really.
though, because two things that I learned from you were being process oriented,
Yeah,
so focus on the process and the results take care of themselves. And then also the big one is, and I still talk about this quite a bit as a believer in stoicism, where they would call it the dichotomy of control, but you framed it to us at the time as controlling the controllables, which is the other side of that is conceding what isn't within your influence.
yeah,
And as a coach, especially when you're coaching teenagers, having then gone on to do that myself, it does occur to you, like, bloody hell, my professional success here is dictated by these kids.
yeah,
And there's
yeah.
only so much I can do, especially in the sport of rowing where there's no halftime chat. You say your piece before they get on the water, which really at that
It's
stage shouldn't be that relevant. And then,
No, you can't fire them up and then send them out onto the field straight away. You fire them up an hour before,
yeah,
and then they've got an hour to digest that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then they've got to get to the right kind of emotional state on the start line an hour later. So it's got to be them. It can't be you on the. You can't do the big rev up footy talk and then pump them out the door, slap them on the back. It just doesn't work in rowing. Well, it might work for some, but I've found, because that briefing is an hour before the race, to pump them up emotionally then is not really that advantageous because they've got to spend an hour getting to that point, so they've got to learn to do it themselves.
And so you believe that would be where you can influence things more is over the course of the season rather than at a particular regatta.
Yep, yeah, definitely. And I'm a big believer now, even at this level or at school level, of practicing those routines that get you to the start line in the physical and mental state that you are going to fire. You're going to be razor sharp. If that gun goes, you're out. I'm out of here. And that, that's a learned thing. You've got to learn. Okay, the coach will talk to me an hour before, and then I've got to go and do a little last bit of stretching, get on the water, get myself up, get fired up in the warm up, and in an hour's time, I've got to be razor sharp. I've got to be, and it's that concept, as you say, of being process orientated. If you can sit on the start line knowing you've done the work, having that inner confidence, and then just with the only thought in your head is, I know what I'm going to do. I really don't care. I don't know what's going to happen in this race, but I know what I'm going to do. I don't care about you guys either side either. I just know what I'm going to do. Bang. And that just takes that other stresses out, mental stresses out, But I do think that inner confidence that you've done enough to be successful is important too. You can't kid yourself if you haven't done enough. It's pretty hard.
Enough is an abstract concept though, because enough, when you don't know what the competition is bringing to the table, and it's also not entirely relevant, but you're trying to wager whether you're enough is going to be at least as much or more than some other crews enough, which you can't account for.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So that comes down to what have you done in the previous regattas? Have you been competitive? Are you somewhere around the mark? It comes down to all of that too, that inner quiet and confidence that we talk about at Olympic final, being able to sit there and know, well, I'm in this. I got a good shot here, and so that's
Certainly felt that at school and less, personally felt that at the school level, and then at Princeton, in the King's Cup, even at some World Cups, but not when it actually mattered the most, which is sort of the thing that I'll probably spend the rest of my life coming to terms with. And it's a lot easier now than it would have been in around 2014, because you move on, you got more time to reflect on things in their whole nature, the good and the bad, and you don't tie your value as a person to the results. But when you're a full-time athlete and that's what you do, and you have peers that where you don't think that the talent is the point of difference, but there's a difference in results, then you do question yourself as a person if you don't have the results that you think were achievable at the one event that matters the most.
Yeah.
And you've coached crews at the Olympic Games where it has gone well, most recently in Paris, and then you've had quadrenniums where that's not been the case and things have been more convoluted. And what do you think that the point of difference is? Do you think it's how much is it to do with circumstances versus your influence?
Well, if I think of my situations, I mean, I'm only over here because I couldn't get the top job in Australia, and if you look at my career, I spent time working under Harold, I spent time working under Dono, I spent time working under Chris O'Brien, I spent time working under Ian Wright, Richo. So I've always been, a lot of years, 20 odd years working under these head coaches. So, but you can never really put your stamp on it if you're working under someone. And as you'd probably know from knowing me, I'm a fairly loyal guy. I'm not going to go against the head coach. It's just not my style. The head coach, that's what he's there for. I'm happy to work, as a productive person in the unit, and he's in charge, and buck stops with him, and I'll do to a large degree, what they want. But it doesn't have my philosophy touch my whole, that can't be the case. So, while I was working under them, I was also running my own programs, at Sydney Rowing Club, Sydney Uni Rowing Club, or Drummoyne, or schools. And I found, over time, the programs that I set up were very successful. And I always wanted to try and do that myself at a senior A level, but I couldn't get that top job where I could stamp my authority or my culture, if you like, on the program. So in the end, you can whinge and moan about it all you want, but it doesn't help you get the job. So in the end, I left because I just wasn't getting to that top level. And then, I had a few issues in 2000, and when was it, 18, 19, with the athlete group. And so that moved me again to say, well, I've really got to, if I want to go to that top level and put my own stamp on a senior A program, I need to go elsewhere, which is when, I looked at the jobs. I had 3 offers there in Switzerland and England and Norway, but I think the English one appealed to me because, I think in the end, Ian went back to New Zealand, to Switzerland, so that one, I lost that one. And then the Norwegians hired another bloke. So, the English one was the one that I went with in the end, which is why I'm here. And then, of course, just in the last 3 years, putting, my own learnings in place here at a top level. Again, I've been able to build a culture that I feel is successful, and it has been successful. You'd have to say that, in the 3 years. So that's probably why I've come. Well, it's the only reason I came to England, was to have that experience of running my own senior A program after all those years underneath various people.
Well, I remember that. I mean, this may, in all of your campaigns, 2007 might not be the most memorable, but I certainly remember it because it was my first senior team, and I don't know if it was yours, but it was very much.
I think it was my first senior A team.
Yeah, and the pair was doing its thing. That was Drew and Duncan.
Incredible race. I still remember that World Championship race. That was just bloody incredible. Those 2 crews way out in front of anyone else.
Yeah, and then Richo was
disappointment of the 4. I still remember that.
Yeah, we had 12th misqualification by a smidgen, and it was obviously given that half the crew, not including me, went on to win Olympic silver medals in that bow class. It wasn't a lack of talent, but it did feel like you were compromised, not for any ill intent, but because the 4 was doing the 8 program, which wasn't your program, and then you basically have to do your best under limited circumstances. And then that more or less was what your coaching looked like within Australia, that you were able to achieve success, but oftentimes it was not to the extent that it could have been because you didn't have your hands on the reins of it.
Yeah. And then, I think that's fair enough. I felt that a lot, over the years there,
And then, so did you get to a point, must have been post Tokyo, where did you feel like it was a fork in the road, even though the crew medaled? So you ended up coaching the women's quad. They won bronze, and I'd imagine you would have put your hat in the ring for the next quadrennium to be in a position where you would have some responsibility, and they didn't go that way. So you thought, I'm going to go in a different direction.
Yeah. I certainly applied for the head coach job then. I think that was I think I've applied for the Australian head coach twice, but twice I've missed out. So that time I missed out to Rhett. So, and then I thought, I'll probably, I could do this again and hang around for another 4 years, but I've really wanted to be a head coach of a national team, so let's look elsewhere. So when I missed out there, I started looking elsewhere. There's no question.
It's a pretty positive landing, so it's not like it's a minnow. You've not gone from, and I don't want to, any country I would say here would be disparaging them, but there's a bunch of programs, I just think, say Lithuania, who have success, but that's small, whereas the British program even more successful, more resources, more expectation of success than even the Australian program. So it was a pretty positive landing spot.
It wasn't when I came. I mean, which is great because then you can only go one way. So the British women had won one medal in the previous quad. They won a bronze medal in the quad in 2017. They might have won one bronze medal in a four or something. So they won some World Cup medals, but no World Championship medals in that whole quad. And then in at the Tokyo Olympics again, they came fourth in about three women's events, but never didn't win a medal. So it was only one. That was the only medal they won in that was the men's eight, the bronze medal in the men's eight. So British rowing was they'd had a lot of turmoil. Jürgen had gone, Tomo had gone. There were no medals for 5 years or so. So, from my perspective, a great point to come in because you're coming in down the bottom. It was very similar for me to a lot of those school programs that I went into. I came in at the bottom, can only go one way. So, a bit of
You seem like
structure and
you
a bit.
like being in that position because you back yourself and because, like you
Yeah,
said, the only way it can go is, well, it can go down. It can get worse, but if
it
you,
could get worse, but never has. So I'm just
yeah,
lucky in that sense.
well,
Lucky
luck,
or
yeah, yeah, yeah. And how did
yeah.
you feel as though the reception was when you arrived?
There were there were some tough times. I came into the program and there were two coaches there that were very established both of them had applied for my job. I'd
Mm.
been given it over them. So it could have been very difficult. Um, but I think, both of them, we certainly had our moments, but they were both very loyal to me in the end. I very, very, they disagreed with some of the things I said, and I always listened a bit. And then if I disagreed, I just said, "Look, I've listened to you, I've heard. No, we're not going down that path. We're going down this way." And I'll just put my foot down. And I think it's a British trait. They're kind of used to that aristocracy. That okay, I'm the
The
chief coach
hierarchy.
hierarchy,
Yeah.
and they come in online. In Australia, I don't think you'd get that. You'd get the little sniping little bits behind your back, and it would be more difficult. But if I put my foot down and said, "No, we're not going down that way. We're going this way," they were very good over the 3 years. They were okay. We're going this way. So very quickly they'd come in behind me and support me. So I felt that one of those big arguments was going to sculling. I wanted to bring the sculling back in, sculling right through December, January, February,
Mm.
across the board, and they were dead against it. But it was, I think that's an important, for all the reasons we know what the single scull is. It's you moving the boat, not it's just you. You
You
can't
can't
tell me
hide.
it's you. It's so all those positives that you get from a single scull, that feel, touch, extra power, strength, that you have to develop yourself. So a
Even
lot of
just some
positive.
symmetry for a portion of the year, like the
Absolutely.
is has a
Absolutely.
big benefit. If you're a say a stroke sider
Yeah.
and you do that, nothing but that for a decade,
You
you're
end up
yeah,
flying
you're
like
gonna get some
that.
overuse stuff. Like I still am proportionally
Yes.
more developed on my left trap, and I haven't taken a
Yeah.
stroke
Yeah.
with a sweep oar in probably a decade.
Yeah. That's so look, so there were that was important that they, came in line with me, and we were a united unit. And all that stuff that we talk about, it was important to build my own culture there because the culture was fairly poor, and it was in England they had up to 12 coaches in the high performance program. So it was definitely one coach, one crew. And when you get that, it's very hard to have a one team approach.
Mm.
So, I found when I came in, I had to break it right down. We're going to load the boat trailer from the bottom, from the top to the bottom, and we're going to unload it from the bottom to the top. And we're going to do all of that as a team, not as a crew. Because when I arrived, the four unloaded their boat and put it on top and disappeared. And the poor scullers are waiting to put their boats on the bottom for 2 hours while everyone else like, oh, shit. I said, what are the boats on the top? Three, four, fours. Let's unrig them. Everyone, go and unrig those, put those boats up. Then get the eights unrigged. So, you do it as a team. And then when we arrive at the venue, we do it as a team. We unload, put all the riggers on. Then we meet. Then we go into our cruise. But it's that one team approach was was not there. So some of those real basics of, let's do this as a team, one dream. That's like football stuff,
Yeah.
NTRs, there's all those things you think of as just things that you can do which don't require talent. Be on time, worth it, that's just work hard. That they don't require any talent. But those NTRs weren't there either. So I was big on those in the first couple of years, just pointing out the things that they could do that didn't require talent, that built a team and an ethos. And so I think that's important.
How do you
Training,
find just without the stuff that was away from rowing, just the living in a different country, different weather, obviously. I mean, how's that? I mean, you know what you signed up for, but I'm thinking more about the kids and the stuff that's less related to the program and what to do with your personal life. How's that
yeah.
been?
I have a daughter with special needs. She's got a genetic defect, so that's been tough running through the system here. Because they have a system here where if you can't fit into mainstream, then you need to apply for an educational assistant plan, and then the government, of course, resists that because it's more money, because your child needs more help or whatever. So that kind of thing's been tough here, just going through that system, and we're lucky enough that we can put her in a special school because she doesn't fit in mainstream. But it is expensive, you pay whatever it is here. What I think we're paying probably £9,000 a term or something ridiculous but she thrives in that environment, not the other environment. So it has been a little bit complex. But for me, that's life, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's you deal with that outside of what your main work focus is. You enjoy your work, but that's a really important part of my life. The kids, and even the kids back home, I'd ring them definitely once every 2 days, 3 days, and have a chat with them and see how they're going. And I just can't imagine how it was before the internet, because how we kept in contact
Sure.
here.
I mean, yeah,
Terrible.
it was rough. It was phone boxes. I was showing my 3-year-old earlier this week. We walked past
Yeah,
the phone box. He's like, "What's that?" Like, it's a
no.
phone box. And I can't believe it was still there. And I
Yeah.
said, you just go pick this up. And I picked it up, and it was gooey. And I was like, "You don't pick it up." And there's a reason. There's a reason we don't use these anymore.
Use them.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that part's been really important. And on the one side, it's been tough because my wife left England 24 years ago to grow up in Australia in the sun, because her mother was Australian, and so she'd been over to Australia several times. So she wanted to grow up and bring the kids up in Australia, and I brought her back here. And in the tough times, she periodically says to me, "Andrew, what am I doing back here? I left here 20 years ago. Why am I back here?"
no
But
question.
on the positive side, it's been good because they have met their English family and cousins and grandparents. We've been able to spend quite a bit of time, so there's a positive there. But yeah, the negatives are the weather. It's the rivers, as you know, the Thames is just a tiny little tributary. You can only fit 2 sculls on at a time. It's very different to Canberra, where I can line 9 pairs across and go 5K down one direction with, competitive with Broome, and you just can't
But
do
that's the
that.
Yarra, and people seem to like rowing on
Yeah,
that, which
how do you do it?
only Victorians do.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
just
think it's to do with
amazing.
it being convenient, but the fact that place produced multiple Olympic
It's
medalists is
amazing,
crazy
isn't
to
it?
me.
Just
Yeah.
amazing.
But
Just
then it
amazing.
seems like you can overcome these obstacles
Yeah.
quite easily but it's not an asset.
No, that's definitely not.
Unless it does make things easier when that's not the case. It's such a limiter that
Yeah.
when you take it
Yeah.
off, that there's, when you
Yeah.
go to, and British rowing seems to do this better than most, is doing proper rowing camps
Yeah.
in great venues, going there for a chunk of time, really supporting the athletes and getting a big performance boost from those.
That is a real contrast for me. They do, although the Australians, I think, with the ETC are very lucky, but
Yeah,
the Brits do it very well. They don't really care about the cost. When they come on rowing camp, they come on rowing camp, and
yeah,
it's high quality nutrition, which is for me one of the big rocks. Just the fueling and that type of thing. If you're going to train 3 times a day, you've got to have good food. They do that side of really well. They don't bushwhack in some tent camp. It's always pretty,
Yeah.
I remember with Australian teams, we'd probably follow the Brits. Where the British staying this time? No, it'll be a good hotel. We'll try and stay there because I remember that in the 2000s and that we were always trying to ride the back of the British because they do their research well. They find the good
Well, I also
hotels.
remember with Jurgen, and it might still be the case with the men. I don't know about the women, but they would go to altitude. I mean,
Yeah,
like we all know this is beneficial if it's
yeah,
well managed, and then they would be at one speed, go to altitude, come back and be faster. And there's
yeah,
just no conversation about whether or not we would do like that is available. There are lakes at
yeah.
altitude. This is possible, but it was never on the
Never
table.
explored.
They put the athletes towards the front of the plane, and I know it's easier when you're traveling around Europe, but there's just stuff like that where when you're competing against that, you're aware of it.
Yeah, yeah. I think watching the men's program here, it is very much like that. It's fairly routine during the weeks that they're at Caversham, and then when they go to altitude, man, that's work camp. That's the work time.
Yeah.
They put the foot down, they work real hard, then they come down, they do a sharpen up camp, and they go to the Worlds, and they're always fast. It's a real contrast
Yeah,
to
there's more of a seasonality to it, and I even think that there's the confidence to have. I feel like on the Australian team, you basically come back and expected to be in the mix in one
yeah,
version or another almost immediately. Whereas there's, I think, a benefit to having some time away, whether that's 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks, and then building,
yeah,
with not having, I don't think there should be any selection events prior to Christmas. That's that's my belief. I think that
yeah,
it's too easy because there's an expectation for medals that you sandwich in selections and variants of selections all throughout the season to the
yeah.
point that you've got all this data, and then in the end, because it's an overwhelming amount of data, it ends up being a subjective decision anyway, when you
Anyway,
could just have the confidence to do that.
yeah, it's very much. Yeah, I can see that totally. Yeah.
I mean,
Uh,
I did have that question for you because I remember at school, which I think for a school level, at least at the time, I think it would even be uncommon now to make it, at least attempt to make it as objective as possible. And
yeah,
I remember some years when it was a little bit more simple, it would be the scull is 80%, the erg is 20%. But
yeah.
there was years where it was the bench pull test is 2.5%, the 5 minute squat test is two and a half
It was, I
percent.
remember.
Yeah. And I
Uh,
felt like, at a school level or even at a national team level, that in the end, it's just trying to give the coaches or the selectors the capacity to present their decisions with certainty. But
yeah,
in the end, we look at every other team sport. So if it's rugby or soccer or field hockey, the coach just picks the
fix it.
crew or picks the
No,
team, right? And then in rowing, it is still a team sport, especially in eight, is really, there's so many intangibles. And then we try and make it this objective thing, which ends up being really convoluted, not fulfilling, more stressful than it needs to be than just, I don't know of any fast eight that hasn't just been picked based on the coach and the selector's opinion.
I totally get it. I totally get it. But it's also from the athletes. We're so, and even in this country, we're so nervous about getting appeal because it is so costly. We had an appeal 2 years ago. It cost us £30,000 to defend it
Is that
because the
right?
athlete has the athlete has complete carte blanche use of English Sports Institute lawyers, and it doesn't cost them a cent. British Rowing has to pay for their defence and their court fees and everything. And of course, we generally you'd win because of the way the policy is
Yeah, the
written.
fine
There's
print's always at the selector's discretion. So it's
it
just,
is.
yeah.
It is. But it cost us 25,000 to defend this. So I think that's the other side of it. That's where it becomes really difficult. And so you try and be as objective as possible so you don't. I'm very conscious of it, even this last weekend, we start with a matrix, to determine a ranking, and then we start with a ladder. So you cross those two. Let's just do a seat swap there, and we work out and try and cover our asses. If we're going to drop anyone off, we just got to make sure that we've done a seat swap so that we can say, okay, that's done. We can leave it there. And then you think, well, what happens next week if it's close? Like, what's the margin? Is it 0.7? Is it 2 seconds? Because Harold used to always say 2 seconds is the margin. Under that, it's not a margin. But John Keogh says 0.01 is a margin, or 0.02 is a margin.
But there's so many
So
variabilities that none of it is a margin.
conditions,
Yeah.
it's just so lanes. So look, it's always fascinated me the fact that a rugby coach can say, "I want that 15 on the team, and that's it, and done." And the rowing coach has to go, "No, you won here. That we've got to do all of that just to justify to the athletes that we want this crew and
And
not."
a rugby team might be a stretch because they've got their own governing body and it's
Yeah,
separate from the Olympics. But if you took the rugby sevens and you took the British
yeah,
women's rugby sevens,
yeah,
that's closer. And
yeah.
they just pick a team. And
I
somehow,
know.
and they still exist scope for appeal, I'd imagine. But imagine if you didn't have to do selection. So you didn't need to taper for it. You didn't need to lose the training time in order to do it. It just seems
Yeah.
like it's a waste of almost a month because then you need a week after it that's a recovery or some version of it.
Stressful. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just crazy. I'd be really keen to explore other ways of doing it, but because rowing is such an objective sport, and the biomechanics people love it because they can measure everything, and we got ergs and we can measure on them. So it's a very measurable sport. People think it should be fairly objective in selection because we can measure everything, but oof,
No,
yeah,
I think it's so subjective. And I
yeah,
think there should just be ownership of that. I
it
always
is.
feel like as well, if you're picking an eight, say it's things go well at a world championships or Olympic games, they row a heat and then a week later they row a final. There's a different sort of athlete that's going to do well
Yeah,
in that as opposed to one that's going to be doing it multiple races a day in varied combinations.
yeah,
And if you're the sort of athlete that, as I was, I felt like they were looking for reasons not to select me.
yeah.
Like I didn't feel like I'm being set up for success, no matter what I believe my contribution
Mm,
can be when the rubber meets the road at a world
yeah.
championships or Olympic games. And I think a lot of athletes feel
Yeah.
like that.
I look, I'm definitely like that. I feel like we can't go selection too many races because it's just unlike rowing. It's just, as you say, eight's one race, 5 days off. So, but you have to do some kind of due process. So it becomes important to figure out where that balance is. And I'm not one for wanting to do 14 races and just seeing who's can do the most endurance. I want the
It could
guys who can.
survive.
It's just,
Yeah.
I think that's a real problem with selection. But yeah, it's certainly a controversial issue, and it's legal now. So we have to. But I think with the system, if I look at the last 3 years, it did become significantly more subjective by the Olympic year. So we start quite objective in year one, year two, it just gets less. By the time you get to the Olympic year, you kind of know where your crews are, whether you have to do a seat race, whether you don't. It does become a bit more, as you say, subjective. And if your crews have been winning medals through that quad, or in the last one it was a 3-year cycle, then it makes it a little bit easier because
Yeah.
you can give them the benefit of the doubt. We're not going to test you. You won a gold medal. Just we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Move along. So that makes it easier too. As you go through the cycle, it does become less subjective. It
Yeah.
becomes more,
And that went pretty
easier.
well, it seems like. Just
You know them pretty well.
yeah.
Exactly.
Um, what are the adjustments that you're making for the 1500 meters in LA?
Well, for me, it's a real dilemma because there's only going to be that one regatta where it's 1500 meters. So all your qualification, all your World Cups, all everything for 4 years will be over 2K, and then you have to shift your focus to the 1500. So we've done quite a lot of research now on, going back to what the women's events were when they were racing 1,000 meters and 1,500, and what were the profiles? How did things change? I don't think they'll change too much because, as you would understand, if you want to move an eight, a couple of percent quicker, the amount of power you need to overcome the drag, as it's an exponential curve, is just ridiculous. So you're probably going to come out the same speed. The profile we think will be, a little flatter through the middle, and there'll be a little spike earlier, for the wind of the line, and the estimations from the BioMech side of things, from Valerie and that, is that it'll be about 2% quicker than, overall speed. So it won't be much. Profiles, we don't expect to change much at all because of that fact that you just can't move that mass quicker out of the blocks by doing more work. It requires too much. You probably move the middle a little bit up, half a percent up, and your spike for the wind of the line will be a little earlier. But psychologically, I think to get out ahead is going to be more, important. So I'm thinking now I've got to bring some start work in now, because if you watched my cruise over the last 3 years, we don't start fast. We're very much Kiwi model. So we start like the Kiwi pair. We come through the 500, fourth, fifth, a lot of the time, and it's the middle 1,000 where we move to the front of the field. It's just been typically across all the crew, even our gold medal crews, women's lighty double, women's quad, still, fourth, fifth through the five. Well, I don't think that's going to be good enough for that 1,500-meter race. So I'm thinking now, well, when we need some meaningful races over 1,500 meters, so we're looking at doing all our trials at 1,500 meters for the next 4 years. So that's a meaningful race, that there's something where they know they have to do well over 1,500. And also, probably trying to do, which we've done periodically in the past, and I think it does work, but bringing some start work in a little earlier. So just being in touch with the start process. So, but doing something around just getting out quicker, not necessarily quicker, but with the field, And,
Yeah. You
so
can't. It's too much of a risk to be off the back.
it is.
A
It is.
shorter
So
race.
yeah,
I'd be curious if you use the erg, you'd get a decent understanding of what the performance difference in output is.
yeah. Well, look, I think that stuff will come in the next few years, because we're all talking about it. We're all talking about, where are our areas of opportunity with regards to, getting a good performance over 1,500. What can we do now, with the knowledge that there'll be nothing over 1,500 meters till that regatta? What can we start doing now to get ahead of the game, and ahead of our opposition? So I think that kind of research we're very conscious of, and we see it as an area of opportunity, and we're looking into, how we can do that on the water, off the water. What is it? What is the profile for 1,500 meters? How much quicker are we going to go? All those things are very much on the discussion table at the moment. In our meetings of what we're trying to do. But
I'd imagine they are, and the full revelations of how different programs approach it are only going to be realized on the other side once the races have been run and things go.
Exactly.
You're going to get
Exactly.
some crews that will do things that people didn't expect and disprove all of the modeling. And then
Yeah.
I'd imagine most of them will align with expectations. And then, like any regatta, it'll be, well, how do people execute on the day?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
One more question I had for you was, I think for a coach, as for anyone, it's important that they take care of themselves mentally, physically, that exercise is, eating well and all of that is part of it. What I've noticed as a coach, especially coaching crews, especially at regattas or camps, is that priority as a person doesn't go anywhere because there's this big professional emphasis, but it needs to be a priority, otherwise it doesn't happen, but it also needs to be proportionate to what's going on. And so you'd see some coaches, when you're traveling and you see them more minute to minute, because you're not just going to the boathouse, but you're staying in some of the same accommodation, some of them training themselves, some of them less, and you can see the coaches that don't over 10, 20 years, and that shows. And
it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there's a range of approaches. So I wanted to know what you thought about that because I've seen you chip away at it, sometimes more successful than others. But now you've got
Yeah.
more responsibility, more moving parts, and yet I think you would still say it. Well, no, it has to be a priority. Otherwise, it's you won't even show up as well as possible as a coach, or as a husband, or as a father.
Yeah, no question. It is a high priority of mine, and I am just lucky that we train at Caversham because that's a 2,000 meter course that I have to ride my bike up and down.
Yeah,
So quite often I do 30, 40K a day, just on the bike, the push bike. And that gives me a base level that I've found I can go to a rowing, when I go to camps, when I go on camp, I train every day. Once aerobically, once in the gym, once aerobic, just stay. And doesn't matter. I'm very lucky that other coaches give me a hard time because if I've missed out during the day because we've done 3 sessions and there's been meetings or whatever, I'll train straight after dinner, 8 o'clock till 10 o'clock. It's no problem for me. I still go to sleep by 11. It's not so. But on camp without the kids and the family, no problems at all. I can do an hour, hour and a half, either in the gym or on a bike or a rowing machine, no problems. And because I ride every day, the transition doesn't get me injured. In Australia, I used to go over to ETC and I'd train every day and I'd used to get injured because I'd start
yeah.
running or off a bad. But because of the riding on a daily basis here, I can
That's a big
transition.
difference, isn't it? Is sitting in a
Massive.
tinny in this sort of
Yeah,
compromised position versus just
just
getting good T1, T2
run.
minutes in.
It is. It's just T1, T2. But I can go straight to an erg, having done no erg work for 2 months, and do 90 minutes, which I could never do before. I'd be injured, without a doubt. But that
90
lovely
minutes on the
base.
erg.
Well, I don't do that much. Occasionally, I
You
might do that,
can do it.
but
Can do it.
but I can do it.
Yeah.
But I would sit on 220 or something. That's freaking 220, 218, something like that. But I can actually do it now, where I couldn't do that 10 years ago. I can only do it because I'm riding the bike every day, and I find that transit, which is very interesting for me, that
Yeah.
I have a base level of fitness from that T1 riding that allows me to go to a camp and get straight on the erg and do, long distance. It's not hard, but without getting injured. So look, it is a priority, but as you would know, I've got 2 kids here. They've got guides. They've got piano lessons. One's got a cello lesson as well. Then they've got tap, and they've got gymnastics twice a week, swimming twice a week. One does acting once a week. It's just full on. So, and with the way that Vicky and I work is Vicky does most of the finances, the bills, and all of that side of things, and I do dinners and so I do the shopping and the cooking and it's just easier for me because I don't have to think ahead. And
Yeah.
so I do that side and Vicky does the other. So I get home from rowing and I'm usually cooking or preparing meals so the time for me to allocate, I justify by saying, well, I've just ridden 40K today, so that's cool. I'll just park that. But I would love to get to a stage where I can actually, you know, do some regular weight training when I'm here in at Caversham. But I only ever seem to get that when I go away on camp, and then I can because I've got no kids. No, if I don't do it, then I'm just a total slack ass because it's got to be an hour in the day when you're on camp to go and do some exercise.
On camp, yes. But
Yeah,
there is a seasonality to it. But that time on the bike is it's same, West Lakes. That
yeah,
was,
absolutely. Mm.
it's a massive difference that I'd probably not reflected on. You think of rowing coaches, there's this sort of, they're all dealing with the same
Yeah,
opportunities and limitations, but that's just not the case.
yeah. No, it's huge because Sydney, you're always in a speedboat,
Yeah.
always. There's just no fitness whatsoever. You spend that 40K a day out alongside the rowing boat, but you do nothing, absolutely nothing.
No, if anything, it's sending you backwards because you're kind of in a fixed position, some
Yeah,
often compromised.
totally.
Um,
So I bagged the course out and having to train over 2K, 90% of the time. But for 10%, that 10%, it's fucking sensational.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
that,
perfect.
and you can, yeah, there's a lot to be said for that environment, not just for you, but for I think for the crews. And if they don't have a problem with it, then
They
there
got
isn't a
no
problem
option
really. Yeah,
because their option is going onto the Thames, where probably the biggest distance between two locks is 5K
yeah,
normally, or less. So then you're turning every 4K on the Thames, and it's not even straight; it's windy and it's narrow.
flow.
So that's what they get brought up on. They're used to it, so
Yeah,
they like Caversham. It's 2K, it's wide, it's laned, it's a lot wider than the Thames. So
great.
yeah,
Well,
they
Randy, really appreciate your time, and thanks for
pleasure.
having the chat, mate. It's good to catch
Good to
up,
catch
and
up. Really, really good to catch up.
and
Yeah.
whatever you're doing is on the water is working for the squad, but you also, I don't know how you don't age. It's like you're some sort of Benjamin Button. I think it's to do with your demeanor and approach. I'd
Yeah.
asked the question as to whether I think it's something you do consciously. There's calmness is something that when I think about you and your approach, that's something I think of, and that seems more innate than manufactured. So,
Yeah, I think it probably is. I'm just a fairly calm bloke. I lose my shit every now and again, as you know, but it's
wow, I only know because I think I was the catalyst on a couple of occasions more than. But when one of your athletes holds up a service station with a cap gun, then that might be the occasion to sort of. I remember two times. It was that once, and also at a state championships. It must have been 2000. I was in the two seed, and we'd come fifth or sixth, and I was, you're just one of the crew, but you definitely pointed out that no, the way you're rowing is sort of contributed to this performance, and you made it pretty clear. The one where you sort of and you're rowing like this, and then you sort of, you pantomime the athlete rowing like a complete asshole. And I'm like, okay, yep, okay, good, get better. But I did get better. So, and
yeah.
I'll always, I think I'm just so fortunate to have had you as a coach at that time. And I've only become more appreciative of that over time. And it's less to do with the oarsmanship and more to do with the everything else. And so for that, I'll always be indebted.
Thank you, Sam. And I'm very pleased with where you've come because I knew you as a youngster,
Yeah.
and to see what you've achieved and everything else is just outstanding. So
All
well
right.
done, and keep it going, keep it going.
Thanks, Doc.
Love to the family and the kids. Look after yourself.